Let's get more on the story and speak to Richard Weitz, who's the director of the Center of Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute, joining me now live from Washington, D.C. Many thanks for joining us on TRT World, Richard. Let's start with this joint statement released by President Putin and President Trump. What do you think it's actually going to mean in practice?
Well, I think that there are two elements of the statement that I was a little concerned about. There was the statement about the commitment of the Assad government to work within the Geneva process and towards free elections and constitutional reform. And I didn't find that very credible given the past lack of enthusiasm on the part of the Syrian government towards that process. It's possible Russia will force Assad to make concessions along those lines, but it wasn't clear. And the other thing that worried me a little was the stress on territorial integrity and national sovereignty in the document, since in the past Russia has used that to claim that only their forces, Iranian forces, Hezbollah, are legitimate forces inside Syria, since they're invited by the Syrian government, whereas other forces, the Turkish forces, the American-backed forces, are not. But otherwise, the statement struck me as unobjectionable: stress on humanitarian process, stress on avoiding a military clash, sustaining communication zones. So there are two things that worried me, but the rest struck me as okay.
I mean, the point is that we can't forget is Russia and the US are on opposing sides in the Syrian war. And given that the statement stressed that there can be no military solution, I mean, is this just empty words, gestures?
Well, it's not. They're not directly on opposing sides. As in most in issues dealing with Syria, it's a very confusing picture. They both oppose ISIS. The Russian government backs Assad. The U.S. government does not. But the U.S. government has not really put forth an alternative force in Syria that would, say, establish a competing government and so on. And they have shared interests in avoiding a direct clash. I think the U.S. would like to work with Russia to reduce the Iranian and Hezbollah presence in Syria, as well as perhaps address some humanitarian issues. So it's a complicated picture. So you could see areas where they could cooperate, but there are also just some fundamental differences that I think the statement smoothed over, but doesn't really resolve.
It is complicated indeed, and one of the US's main strategies in Syria in getting rid of Daesh has been arming and supporting the SDF, which is mainly made up of the YPG, which, as we know, Turkey sees as a terror group and has been a huge sticking point in their relationship with the US. What do you think is going to happen to the US's support for this group once Daesh has been pushed out of Syria?
Yeah, that's a really good question. As you know, the Turkish Prime Minister was in Washington meeting with Vice President Pence and other officials, and I'm sure they discussed this, but we haven't really got a readout yet on what were the results of that. I mean, I think it's pretty evident from what happened in Iraqi Kurdistan that the U.S. Wouldn't directly confront the Turkish government militarily over the Kurdish issue. But I think that how they would resolve these differences, how Turkey can be assured of its security and territorial integrity, without impeding the rights of the Kurdish Syrians to defend themselves from the Assad government. I think that's a bit unclear, and I think we're still waiting for the readout from the many important meetings that were held here last week in Washington.
Okay, Richard, appreciate you joining us on the program. Richard Weitz from the Hudson Institute there live in Washington, D.C.